Hey everybody, Lindsey Smith here with your business tip this week. This week I was asked a question by one of our realtors on what is the best way to explain transaction brokerage when you bring a client to one of your listings to buy it, or one of our other CIR agents is going to be bringing a client in here. And she just wanted to know exactly how to explain it. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. This one's going to be a little bit longer, but bear with me, you guys are going to get some great information. One of the things to keep in mind with transaction brokerage is that your clients want you to bring the buyer into the property or have CIR Realty bring the buyer more than just about anything in the world. This is why they're hiring you. Can you imagine a seller that says, go out, advertise the property, promote it, sit open houses, but don't bring any buyers in. I don't want you to bring any buyers or introduce any buyers to the property. It's absolutely ridiculous. They want you to be the one to sell the property. And think about it. Sometimes people lose listings because other agents walk in and say things like, oh yeah, you know, I might have a buyer already for your property waiting in the wings so that we can get a quick sale on your home. And I know agents that have lost listings because other people have said that. And that's just putting them in a position for transaction brokerage. A huge benefit of being with CIR Realty is that we are the largest in Calgary with right around 700 agents. So think about that. You have 700 people who you can network with to get your seller's property exposed out there. That's a huge benefit to your seller. No other brokerage has that. We have 4 offices that all work together and you have more people to collaborate with. I know that when I sold real estate, I put many deals together simply by hanging out in the office and talking to people about the properties that I have for sale. Sellers love that stuff. Every other brokerage that's out there, whether it's a franchise, they have smaller offices that act as islands because they're independently owned and operated. You don't see people from one franchise going to another independently owned office's office meetings to try to network and things like that. It doesn't happen, whereas CIR fosters a collaborative atmosphere and gives your clients a better chance to have CIR Realty or yourself directly bring a buyer to that property. So this is a huge benefit to your clients. So don't lose sight of that when you go to explain this to your clients or when you go to promote yourself and CIR Realty in your listing presentation. Okay, so let's get down to the nitty-gritty. Now you're sitting in front of the client and you need to explain transaction brokerage. Well, I believe that this is a 2-step process, and step number 1 had to happen before you even sat down, before you even listed the property. You need to make sure that you protected your clients in advance and set them up for success. So here's one of the tricks that you can do. I recommend that you hand them a few pieces of education in advance to prepare them for a time when they might be in a transaction brokerage and you can no longer advise them specifically on how to proceed in a transaction. One of the documents I recommend that you guys bring in is called Creating a Binding Contract. And you can present this on your iPad or hand them a piece of paper or email them a PDF in advance. And you can find this under our article and template database under the CIR Professional Development on the virtual library. But the article is called Creating a Binding Contract. And it goes through the different aspects of a contract that your client may want to consider. This is things like the conditions. This is things like the different terms that might go in there. So in addition to this document, another document that you may want to provide is we have one for sellers and one for buyers, and it's called the Step-by-Step Guide to Buying and the Step-by-Step Guide to Selling. And this takes this concept and extends it even further so that your clients can be aware of the process so that they can begin to protect themselves even without your direct impartial advice, which you would be providing when you're in transaction brokerage. A third document that you'll want to consider is handing them a list of preferred service plus suppliers right out of the gates. And here's how I recommend you do it. Take an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper and write down 3 lawyers, 3 mortgage brokers, 3 home inspectors, and have the one that you use most highlighted at the top, and explain at the bottom that, you know, your clients, you do not guarantee the results, you've used them and individual results may vary, but make sure that you indicate the people that you use the most on the top of the page, and make sure that you provide this list to both people in the transaction. So if it's another CIR agent, you may want to make sure that they have a copy of the article package that you brought your clients as well, but in advance make sure that you give this document to your clients so they can see exactly who you are recommending as professionals and the one that you've used the most. And when you provide it in advance and it's something that you do for every client, it's consistent, so it's no longer you providing an advantage to either the buyer or the seller because you're providing equal information to both. So do not forget the fact that you need to be prepping your clients in advance so that they're not just completely left alone when you get into transaction brokerage. Let's talk about step 2 in the process. So step 2 is going to be us sitting down with the client, getting ready to present this offer. But before we do that, we have to educate them on exactly what the implications are of transaction brokerage and get the buyer's agreement to it and also the seller's agreement to it. So we're going to need 2 documents for this. Document number 1, we're going to need our agency relationship guide. And again, on your iPad, or you can print it out, either way is just fine. And number 2, you're going to need your common law transaction brokerage agreement to form part of that agreement showing that both parties agree to transaction brokerage. The explanation portion of this is when you're sitting down with them, I recommend having the agreement out and just reviewing it one more time so that they are familiar with it. So the agency relationship guide, you can explain it and it might sound something like this. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I have some great news for you. We do have an offer coming in on the property, obviously, which is why I'm here. And before I present the offer to you, and I haven't looked very detailed over the terms yet, so let's not get too excited, but I do want to explain to you how this is going to work because things are going to change a little bit. One of the huge benefits here is the power of CIR prevails again. We have one of our other agents bringing an offer in, which means now that CIR Realty will be representing both sides of the transaction. So some of the implications here is that it'd be impossible for our brokerage to represent you and get you the highest price possible for your house, and to also represent the buyer at the same time and get them the lowest price possible. So you can see how there might be a conflict with our brokerage representing both sides. So this is going to change the relationship that we have as your agent and the relationship that the buyer has with their agent. So let me explain a couple things. Do you guys mind if I take you through a couple details before we look at the offer? Great, wonderful. So we have our agency relationships guide. You guys have seen this before, but I just want to review it. In typical agency, where it's sole agency, where I represent you, and we have another brokerage that represents the buyer, I owe you 6 legal duties. I owe you undivided loyalty, confidentiality, I owe you full disclosure, obedience, reasonable care and skill, and full accounting. In a case where we now represent both sides of the transaction, or if I had brought the buyer just myself, things change a little bit. Now we're in a position where we treat both sides of this transaction totally fairly, and it's called transaction brokerage because we become simple brokers of the transaction. We will provide you with all the information that you need to make an educated decision, and then it'll be up to you to decide how you would like to proceed. And the same information that we provide you, we're going to provide to the buyer to ensure that everyone is treated in a fair, even-handed fashion. One of the things about disclosing all the details in this transaction to both parties is for you to know that there are certain things that we will never disclose. Number 1, we'll never disclose if we know that you're willing to accept a price lower than your listing price. The other thing we'll never disclose is the fact that if we knew the buyer was willing to pay a price higher than their offer. In addition, we'll never disclose the motivation about why you're buying, why you're selling and they're buying. And also, we will never disclose personal information. So you can, rest at ease knowing that all that information will always stay confidential. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I do have to make you aware of one more option that you do have, and that is to decline all representation from CIR Realty altogether. In this case, we would provide you with the forms. You're still entitled to reasonable care and skill and fair business practices on our part, honesty, things like that. However, In addition to the forms, we would provide you with no representation. The other side of the transaction here, the buyer would be represented by us completely. They would enter into a sole agency relationship. However, we would be entitled to represent you in no way, shape, or form. Everything you've told us that's in confidentiality would remain confidential, but beyond that, there wouldn't be any other services that we would be able to provide you outside of the listing agreement. So I just wanted to make you aware that you do have that option, but most people, obviously, for obvious reasons, stick to some form of representation within transaction brokerage. So understanding that, one of the things that I want you to do is pull out the information package that I gave you, and I brought another one for you as well, and I have also given this to the other side of the transaction, but there's a copy of creating a binding contract there. There's a step-by-step guide to selling, and I want you to reference the offer part because it's going to explain the typical conditions, terms, things like that the other person has put in. In addition, that preferred list of suppliers that I gave you, we've also made it available to the buyer so that they know what's happening. And again, we're treating people in a fair, even-handed fashion. So we have another agreement here that I would like to explain to you, and it just talks about the formal details, and I will need you to sign off on this. Again, just saying that you understand that we are now representing both sides of the transaction. Once you've gone through the agency relationship guide, you can now pull out your common law transaction brokerage agreement and just explain to them, due to the nature of the transaction, the fact that we'll be representing both sides and bringing a buyer, we need you to agree to this in writing. So what we're going to do is explain to you really quickly some of the things we didn't touch on in the guide, and I'll just skim over the stuff that we did. And at that point, I would start reviewing it with the seller, and I'm not going to go through it in detail. Again, you can do it on your iPad or have it printed out or on your tablet PC. But just go through it, explain them the parts, and then at the end of it, I would say something like this. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, if you guys are good with this and you guys want to move forward and take a look at the terms of the offer, then what I'll do is just get you to sign off here, and we can move into the fun part of taking a look at the offer and getting your house sold. That's our explanation of transaction brokerage. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to contact me. If you guys have anything else you want me to cover, feel free to fire me off an email or fire off Stacey Parks an email. It's sparks@cirrealty.ca. She's our new professional development coordinator, and so she's handling a lot of this stuff. And we'll be sure to get your questions answered and continue to bring you guys some great information. That's it. All the best and doing a ton of business for the rest of the year.